This is Season 2, Episode 5 of the Launch School podcast. In this episode, I got a chance to speak with Nick Calibey, a Capstone graduate and software engineer at TimescaleDB. We talked about how he went from getting his master's in Theological Studies to now working on cloud infrastructure, making six figures, all working remotely from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Nick is one of the first remote people we took into Capstone, so the remote job hunt is a topic we focused on in this conversation. Now, this episode was recorded in late 2019. It is now April 2020. At the time of recording, we were not yet in a pandemic, and so we didn't talk about that at all. Now, in April 2020, we're in the middle of quarantine and shelter in place rules, and all employers are interviewing remotely. I think remote jobs will only become more prevalent, especially in software, and I hope this conversation shows that there are also amazing engineering centric remote jobs within the reach of launch school graduates. Enjoy the conversation.
Welcome to the Launch School podcast, where we discuss education, programming, and how to build a rewarding career in software engineering.
Welcome to the Launch School podcast. Today we have Nick Calibey. Hey, Nick, how are you doing today?
Doing well, thanks.
All right, Nick. So you finished Capstone. It's been how long now? 6 months or something like that?
Yeah, since we completed our project in around the end of December, so I guess 6 months since the job hunt had started in January or so. Well, after the job hunt, 6 months or so. I've been at my current job. So
Yeah. So you've been working for a while now, and I've been trying to this season interview some folks who are not in launch school in Capstone but have finished and have been working for a little bit. So to share a perspective in terms of how what they learned at launch school has contributed to their job. So that's why you're on today. Are you ready to talk about that?
yeah.
Before we get into that, maybe just a real quick, what are you working on now? Where are you? What do you do?
So I currently work for TimescaleDB. Timescale is a time series database. More specifically, it's a PostgreSQL extension, and it allows for high ingestion rates for Postgres. Normally, SQL databases aren't well known for dealing with lots of inserts, and Timescale kind of solves that problem for time series data. More specifically, I'm on the cloud team, so I'm helping to build out Timescale's cloud native offering. So eventually we can have a kind of Timescale as a service.
It sounds amazing. Time series databases are just such a hot topic nowadays.
Yeah.
It's so cool to get into a company like
I'm
TimescaleDB.
trying to remember, I think I've seen a few places that they are right now the kind of the most popular databases popping up.
Yeah.
Timescale is one of them. I think the big NoSQL one everyone heard of is InfluxDB. So
Yeah, it's just one of the hottest areas right now, and it's just amazing place to be, amazing area and domain to develop expertise in. And where are you located?
I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Is that Timescale DB headquarters?
No. Timescale's American headquarters is in New York City. So I am full-time remote. Most our team is, Timescale as a company is a distributed company. We have a bunch of people in Europe, and we have a bunch of people over the States. I think we recently just got our first Canadian.
Oh, wow.
So, we are a global team and a distributed team by nature.
That's cool. That's kind of like the Capstone project where everyone's all over the place and
it was a nice way to segue in because of the way Capstone works and how I worked with my teammate Sasha completely distributed. She was at the time in Chicago, and I'm still in Tulsa. I was already used to that kind of flow, so transitioning to Timescale wasn't a problem at all.
Yeah. All right. Sensitive question. Are you willing to share how much you make?
Yeah. Currently,
yeah.
Yeah. Currently, I have a six-figure salary.
In Tulsa.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah. No, not bad at all.
Working for Timescale database, DB. So that's pretty amazing. How did you get here? So I know launch school is part of that journey, but maybe maybe just right before launch school. Maybe we don't have to start from childhood, but from maybe education and onwards, and how you got into launch school and all that.
Sure. Well, I had done my undergrad at the University of Connecticut, graduated in 2011, had a couple years off. One of those years I went and I did City Year, which is an AmeriCorps program, basically working in inner city schools, helping kids trying to improve their grades, stuff like that. And then after another year off, I did a master's degree at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Brookline, Mass. which is where I met my wife at the time. And so we got married.
This is Massachusetts, you said?
Yeah, that's in Brookline, Mass. Yeah, Massachusetts. A couple months after I graduated, because it was only a 2-year degree, a master's degree, my wife and I got married. And within the first couple months, she was pregnant with our first kid. Originally, I wanted to go into academia and maybe pursue a doctorate, but I had to realize the fact that with my wife being pregnant and knowing that I was, we're going to have this family, did I really want to put my family through 7 years of postgraduate studies and doctoral studies to, at best, probably walk out as an adjunct professor, making maybe minimum wage if I'm lucky? So it was clearly no. And I had to kind of put aside my own wants for the sake of my family and find something else. And it was kind of a year of not knowing what to do, kind of looking around, seeing what I could make of my English degree. And nothing really was coming out of it. And so at the behest of actually a priest that I knew, he kept telling me to go into programming, which I was a little resistant to. I had no background in programming. Both my degrees are in the humanities, so I figured I probably just didn't have the right brain for it. In hindsight, I think sometimes the left-right division is a little overstated because, when you're dealing with heavy philosophy, guys like Heidegger or Kant, you develop, your right brain quite a bit too, even though that's shoved into the humanities. But the programming experience I did have, which I guess I could call as a background, wasn't programming per se, but back when I was even younger, I used to do a lot more video games. And in particular, I would do a lot of kind of custom map making and mod editing. And I think some of the same ideas that go into that, if-else conditionals, booleans, events, triggers, and how they all affect one another, they all play into programming. It's just you're doing everything through a graphical user interface. So programming, it eventually came easy to me. I finally said, okay, I'm going to go this route. But the problem was then what? I didn't want to go back to school again. I already had 2 degrees. I didn't want to have to go to a comp sci degree. And I was looking online, looking at a lot of boot camps, but of course they were wanting a lot of money, money I really didn't have. And then I stumbled across Launch School. And the 2 things about Launch School that sold me, the first, of course, is the price. $200 a month is definitely affordable. But the other thing was the mastery-based learning paradigm, because it really didn't take a lot of convincing for me. I didn't have a name for it, but it's pretty much the paradigm I had kind of stumbled onto myself for learning languages. In my time before grad school, I had learned Japanese, and then in grad school, I had to learn Greek. And kind of when I was learning Japanese, there was all these kind of things for languages of shortcuts, and you can learn it, this way or that way. And I eventually got fed up, and I just said, okay, get me a grammar book and I'll get flashcards and I'll do it the old fashioned way with a tutor. And that worked. And it kind of, I think, was evidence to myself of this kind of, just put your nose in the books, do it the old fashioned hard way, and it's probably going to work fine. In Launch School, mastery-based learning in general kind of reminds me of that. Learn the fundamentals, learn them well, lots of practice. It's not always going to be the most exciting. That's fine, because you're going to have the foundation, the base later on for doing other things. So I did the orientation April of 2017. I started the paid program in June of 2017, and I finished the core curriculum in July of 2018. So it took me slightly over a year.
Was it full-time? Were you working?
So in the beginning, it was not full-time. I had another job. I was working as a contract worker, and, I was doing 30 hours a week there, and I try to get 15 hours a week for Launch School. That eventually stopped. And so then I was kind of doing part-time. I would say full-time, but really is part-time, because at that time I was watching my my 1-year-old daughter and also doing Launch School. So it was kind of
like 2 jobs. Yeah.
Yeah. My wife works as a PRN SLP, a speech language pathologist. So, it's not a part-time gig. It's when they need her, but the company she works for thankfully needs her quite frequently, at least then. And of course, in March of 2018, my son was born. So then we had 2 kids. And near June, I want to say around May to June, May through July of 2018, I was actually able to go full-time 40 hours a week, Launch School. And that's when I really kicked through the remaining portion. I think I did the course 230 in a month, which is really hard. Yeah. But I kind of had to, because I knew I was going to be doing Capstone.
Right.
And so I just pushed myself. But yeah, at that point, I was able to do it full time. So, but I mean, and everyone has to go at their own pace. Like I said, I've already had kind of previous exposure to this paradigm. So I was able to do it, I think, a bit quicker than maybe people who hadn't. I was already used to it. So people where launch school, it's the first time they've encountered mastery-based learning, it's going to take longer. That's totally fine.
Right.
You have to learn how to learn first. I kind of already had that, so it made it a bit easier.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of people are attracted by our pricing, right? Because they come to us thinking it's a low price, but it's not. We lead with our pedagogy, and we always say we have a pedagogy-led pricing, right? So sometimes people say, well, of course you want people to stay as long as possible because you have this monthly pricing scheme. But our monthly pricing scheme is actually a result of our mastery-based pedagogy. So it's a reflection of that. And like you said, if you are somebody who has a history of excellent learning habits and you know how to learn, you know exactly what you need to do every step of the way, you can get through this fairly quickly. But if you haven't developed that, it's okay. Take your time, right? Take your time to learn the core study skills that's going to be important, not just to get you a job, but to stay at a job and keep growing your career, right? These
Right.
are absolutely critical skills. Like, for example, since you've been working, how many new technology topics or concepts have you had to learn in like 6 months?
Oh boy. So first of all, I program in Go or Golang, right, which is not taught at launch school.
Right. At all,
So
right.
I had to learn. Now, to be fair, I started learning Go a couple weeks before I officially accepted the role at Timescale because there was another company that was looking pretty good at that I knew I would also be learning Go, and I wanted to learn it anyway. And I think Go has the advantage that for a typed language, it's a lot easier to I think it's much easier for someone if they want to learn a typed language to transition from Ruby and JavaScript like you have at launch school to something like Go, as opposed to something like Rust. I think Rust is a much steeper learning curve. I don't think Go does, and so it makes a great language to kind of transition. So I had to learn more of Go though and get better at it. And then let's see, since then, gRPC. So it's the Google Remote Procedural Calls, the protobuf syntax that goes with that. For streaming architecture, we use something called NATS, nats.io. It's part of the CNCF, or the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's one of their incubating projects. I have a little bit of experience with Kafka from when I worked on Kronos, my Capstone project, so that did help there. The streaming concepts were already there, but of course I had to learn the new API. I had to learn GraphQL for one of the microservices I had to build.
Which we don't cover at launch school either.
Yeah, which we don't cover at launch school. I had to learn GraphQL and implement it in Go. I had to learn, lately I've been learning Prometheus for doing metrics, other things like GitLab, Kubernetes, of course. I knew Docker from my project, but I really didn't have a lot of experience with Kubernetes. So I had to ramp up on that. And of course, using things like Helm, which are for doing Kubernetes deployments.
So what if there are students who are like, hey, if you give me a chance, I'm willing to learn all those things. Like Go, I don't know Go. I don't know how to program, but I'll learn Go. I'll learn Prometheus. I'll learn Kafka. I'll learn Docker and Kubernetes. Like, if you give me a chance, I'll do it. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, if you don't know how to program, I don't understand how you're going to do any of this. But you have to show a strong aptitude in the fundamentals behind front end and back. Well, on the sphere that you're going to work on. So I work on back end development, I guess you could say, microservice architecture, but it's back end. I don't work on the front end. But if you can't show that you don't understand the basic foundational concepts pretty well, you're not going to get this kind of a job. They're only going to trust people who can pick up these technologies real quickly because they've shown how to do it previously. I think that's what Kronos really was. Keep in mind, before Sasha and I made Kronos, we had never even heard of Apache Kafka. We had never heard of streaming architecture or event-driven architecture, right? Which is what Kronos is as a system, just to an extent, and not quite. But, and we also hadn't heard of time series databases. We hadn't heard of Docker. These are all things that we had to learn, but that was after the core curriculum. And it's because it was after the core curriculum, we were able to drill down real quickly and learn the concepts. And I want to be clear, it's not just programming, right? I think especially when you're working on a cloud infrastructure, you need to have at least a fundamental grasp of distributed systems and how those works. I know Julius gave a talk, Julius Derwick, not too long ago. That's the next level beyond, right? If you can't code the basics that we know at launch school, I don't think you're going to be able to wrestle with a distributed system and things like hexes and having to use locks and race conditions and all sorts of stuff that comes with that, and eventual consistency, et cetera, et cetera. These are all more advanced topics. And it's kind of like, even when you approach any of these frameworks, you look at Kubernetes, you want to do the more advanced stuff right away. But even with Kubernetes, you need to have a basic understanding of what Kubernetes is for, the problems it's trying to solve, and how to use it at a very basic level before you can go into the more advanced stuff. It's always the temptation is to grab, I think, for the new tool without understanding why you're using it. I had a friend of mine who's a developer, and we were kind of talking about this with front end. He says, I can always tell when an app is a React application because it takes a bit longer to load. And he says a lot of the time his frustration with React is not as a framework, because he thinks it's very good for what it's meant for, which is very interactive applications. But he sees it used in cases where static HTML would be fine, right? And that's not the use case for React. Now, that might be the use case for something like Gatsby.js, but that's not the use case for React if you have a basic, homepage. It's just not, because if it's a static page, you don't need to be, using, I think, the React DOM, etc. And I think it's a misunderstanding of what tools are for, because they're what's in and new. Kubernetes was built for a particular reason. Prometheus was built for a particular reason, and you need to understand the reasons why they were built before you can apply them to your own systems.
Understand the problems that are solving, not the tool. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And even with these tools, you're not going to master them. It's not like launch school. Once you get into a job, you have to learn a baseline. So you usually reach for a tool even when you're working on a job for a particular reason, right? I needed to know the basics of Kubernetes because we need to be able to deploy this microservice to our development environment. So I need to just go and look at the documents for Kubernetes and Helm just so I can get the job done for the day. And then on other time is when you continue to go deeper into these tools to get a better understanding. I think with launch school, when you're learning Ruby or when you're learning JavaScript, it's all you're really focusing on. Once you're in a job, you're kind of doing two tracks at once. You're getting what you need to know to solve the particular task at hand. And then kind of on the side, you're learning the tool in better depth because you're going to be needing it.
Yeah, you got to solve that short-term problem. You can't be sitting there for 3 months, trying to master Kafka before you even use it.
Because even Kubernetes, I know it's the one I keep harping on. It's because it's a popular technology right now. If someone says, you need to set up a Helm chart for this, you're not going to go and do mastery-based learning for a month on Kubernetes and Helm.
Right.
It may take longer, to be honest, but you're not going to be able to do that first and then and solve your problem within the next couple days.
You got to do just-in-time learning, right? Which is in contrast to mastery-based learning. And just-in-time learning is a concept I wrote about in our Medium publication on Launch School, and it is exactly what employers are looking for, and it's the type of learning that you need to employ on the job. And that's why there's a fallacy of just learn barely enough to get a job, and you'll learn everything you need on the job. Well, you're not going to be able to do mastery-based learning on the job. So you better make sure your fundamentals are good. Right? Otherwise, you won't ever be able to make that jump, because the only thing you can and employers will give you time to do is just-in-time learning.
Yeah.
And another thing you said about distributed programming and distributed systems, how it's sort of the next step from just coding like a little application. I think it reminds me of that phrase where I read it sets I forgot who the author is, but it says something like the difference between software engineering and programming is that software engineering is programming integrated over time, right? So it's this idea of these applications. Sure, you build an application, but when you are thinking about this application being deployed over a long period of time with a lot of usage, you have a lot of data, all of a sudden, you have all these different concerns that come up besides just how, what happens when I click this button, right? It's not really feature or code specific. It's really data specific and how data flows across infrastructure. And that's just becoming a bigger and bigger problem as all the applications consume more and more data. And obviously why something like time series database exists. And certainly that's, I think, an evolution of the next step of software engineering, thanks to the proliferation of cloud services. But from a learning perspective, right, you got to go one step at a time. It doesn't mean you just go there, right? Because software engineering as a field has been progressing, has been evolving, and you sort of just have to go from the beginning, right? You have to learn basic variables and programming languages, basic networking concepts, basic database concepts.
Yeah.
By basic, I mean just like relational database concepts, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people see these sort of new technologies come out, just a few years ago, it was like MongoDB, right? Should I learn Mongo instead of relational database? No, you shouldn't, right? You should learn relational database and then learn Mongo if you want.
Mm-hmm.
And I think same thing with time series database, right? Imagine somebody not knowing how a relational database works and jumping straight into time series database. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I still don't know how to use Mongo, but
yeah.
But no, it's true. I think the intimidation comes from with the explosion of technologies that come, especially I think in the JavaScript world in particular. With I saw a quote, I forget where it's from, but a new drinking game could be you find a word and then see if there's a that.js as some sort of framework, and if there is, you take a drink.
There's not. You got to create one.
Right. But the thing is, speaking from experience now, because again, I had no formal programming training before launch school, is that once you know the fundamentals of how it works, it's not hard to pick up these frameworks. In fact, you can pick up the base. I mean, if you go get like a Udemy, which is udemy.com, course for $9.99, right? $9.99 on something like React. You go through that, you're going to have a pretty good idea of how to use React, and you're going to be able to. You'll be surprised how many times the instructor will stop and say, well, in this syntax here, this is what you're doing. You're like, I know, I had to write about that on my test. And you'll be fine. And even picking up new language, I mean.
But doing it the other way, I think, is really detrimental. I think that's where a lot of people start, right?
Because you're putting the cart before the horse, right? If you don't know how to use JavaScript, if you don't know how to program, how are you ever going to figure out React? I mean, I don't understand how you could. And if you did, you'd be so limited in what you could do, and you don't want to do that because it limits your options of what jobs you want to do, and it's going to stultify you, and you're not going to enjoy that, And the thing too is that even if you get out of the idea of JavaScript, once you know a couple programming languages, you pretty much can go and learn any of them because they're a lot more similar to one another, the majority of them, than you would think.
Right.
We're
all solving the same problems, right? And
right.
There's similar problems. And if you understand the problems, then as different solutions pop up, you're just like, okay, that's a new solution. It takes a different approach to solving this problem. But if you understand the problem well, you'll be able to appreciate the solution much easier. New solutions much easier.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So kind of bringing it back to learning a little bit, I wanted you to maybe expound a little bit more on your background in philosophy. And I know you thought about that, or theology, and how that maybe helped you in programming, or I don't know if I'm saying that too much, but or didn't help you, right? The reason I ask is because I notice we have a lot of philosophers at launch school, and they do really well. And I don't mean like, I guess you can be just kind of a weekend philosopher, but I mean like people who have PhDs in philosophy. Let's say that's the group I'm talking about.
Yeah. So I think what it is in the branch that I was most interested in for in the degree I got, which my theology degree was called systematics. And systematics has to deal a lot with philosophical problems, things of epistemology, etc. And so you're not just reading, you're reading figures from, I said I'm Greek Orthodox, so guys like people wouldn't have heard them before, but Zizoulis or Forovsky. But then at the same time, you're reading the philosophical influences of that time period as well. So like I said, one of my classes, we were reading parts from Being in Time by Heidegger. We were reading, parts of Fichte and Schelling from German idealism, because they had an influence on thinkers like Bulgakov. And so I think the main thing here is when we're discussing these ideas, they are very hard concepts. And then, of course, you have to write about them. So you have to have a firm grasp, at least of the fundamental ideas that these people are wrestling with, being able to explain it, and then, of course, offering your own thoughts on it. And, I don't mean it in the sense of you could write anything and that goes. You have to really show you understand what's being said if you're going to write on it. And I think, too, of course, you're making arguments, so you need to make sure your arguments are sound. I think that's true of any branch of philosophy, at least of the schools I had read up to. Because I also did, an independent study reading ancient philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Porphyry, Proclus, Plotinus. And so for me personally, I think that's what it helps is, I'm not worrying about the problem of forms and the world being in flux or anything. Programming, but it's the same thing of seeing when you set up, I wonder now, is an interface a form? No, but in all seriousness, I think it's the same thing of just looking at how you're structuring your code and seeing where that will end up.
Yeah.
And the more you get practice with this, the more you can kind of start to see problems come before they show up, and you're able to program a solution. So one programming pattern, like I said, I use Go, that I've gotten used to now is, there's no real concept of interfaces in Ruby or JavaScript. I know TypeScript does have interfaces, but it was something new I had to learn for Golang. And it was really nice because it allows for a design pattern that allows you to make stubs and mocks real easily. And allows for a lot more advanced design patterns, so things are less coupled. And I've really enjoyed it. And the more I've started to code with it, it's become kind of more second nature. When I first started, I didn't really use them much in my early PRs. And then the more I kind of saw from my peers, the more it changed my own practices. So now it kind of has become second nature, and you see the design benefits of it. It is in general, So I think that's kind of how the background plays in, just that same kind of thinking. And that I would also say applies to English literature, depending on the type of English literature that you're, the kind of hermeneutics you're using with English, which for mine were pretty similar. I always cared about authorial intent, so you had to make rigorous argumentation as to why the author is making, this thematic argument in a work.
It's just like working with abstract ideas, right? Concretizing abstract ideas, and software is what we do and translate it to code. And in philosophy, you write things down. But I think there's a lot of similar qualities, similar skill sets at play. That's just one observation I've made, and I've said this before, but people with a law background, same thing, tend to just have a sort of natural affinity towards programming and the sort of demands of the interpreter or the compiler.
I think in general, coding is, we always talk about in PDAC, right, that the kind of coding is the easiest part because you're really just translating ideas into.
That's right.
The hardest part is thinking through the problem, and even at Timescale, for some of the microservices I've had to build, I have to do design documents first. And you could be great at coding, but if you can't think about how a system works in the abstract first and really give a strong reasoning for why it should be architected a certain way, it doesn't matter how good you are at coding. It's not gonna work.
That's right. That's one of the major things I want people to take away, even from the very beginning stages of launch school, which is coding is necessary, just like writing is necessary to convey ideas. But having good ideas and formulating good ideas is key, right? Understanding problems is key. So it's really about, and that just takes a little bit of time, to simmer and digest, right? It's not this weekend you're going to understand it all, this whole thing. It's just, it may take a weekend, it may take 2 weekends, but so be it. It's gonna pay off. I wanted to ask about your job hunt process because you're one of the few remote job seekers, at least thus far in Capstone. Wanted to see how that experience was, and if I know you talk to your cohort mates and sort of compare and contrast with them a little bit. Maybe share a little bit there for people who are interested.
Yeah. So like I said before, I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm not from here originally. I was born and lived in West Hartford, Connecticut for pretty much my whole life until I got married. My wife is from Tulsa originally. So after we got married, I moved here. And so obviously the tech scene in Tulsa is not startup oriented. It's a lot more, there's a lot of Windows kind of, it's dominated heavily by .NET C#, which is, a lot of stuff on Windows as opposed to Unix systems, which is kind of more what we're used to. And so I really didn't want to do it. There's a couple places here and there that offered something more in the lines of what you're learning at launch school. And I got pretty far in the interview process with one of them. I won't say the company name because they kind of basically had an offering that they didn't actually have. And so they ended up kind of wasting a lot of my time, which was frustrating. But For the remote hunt, it's interesting. I think coming out of launch school, whether you do Capstone or not, you need something strong to get your foot in the door, because I do think remote work is growing. I think it makes sense being on the internet for more and more distributed teams. I do think, though, that the lack of experience can hurt you in a remote job hunt, insofar as, usually I think when companies are looking for remote candidates, if they're not a fully distributed company, they want to generally have candidates with experience, because I think they can. This is all my intuition, by the way. I don't know this, right?
Yeah.
I think it's because they feel they can trust them more because they have some experience, right? They have some background, and as someone who doesn't, they feel like they might be taking more of a risk. And I totally understand that from a company perspective. One of the things I think students coming on launch school, they'll have that will mitigate this is the fact that you've done all of launch school in a distributed learning system, right? So you could talk about that. And for us too, with our Capstone project, we did it distributed. So again, it was really easy to be like, I'm used to this kind of workflow. I've worked on distributed teams before. So I've dealt with the things that come with that. And I'm fine with that. Some people aren't, and they want to find something local. I understand. I'm totally fine. I like working distributed.
Do you think having some prior experience in this case is actually an advantage? In other words, for like career changers, this might be a little bit of advantage, because remote work just requires higher demands for professionalism and communication that maybe somebody fresh out of college may not have developed already.
Yeah, I think launch school in particular is going to give you at least that distinct advantage because you're used to it, right? You're used to doing it both in the core curriculum, and then if you do Capstone or something, you're used to doing it. You'll definitely be used to doing it, and it will definitely give you a huge advantage. And I personally love working remote because it gives a lot of personal flexibility. I can be at my house at one day. Like today, I'm not at my house as I'm doing this. I could go to a different state if I needed to and work. So it gives. I personally prefer that, and I kind of like that it's just me and the computer because it allows me to focus real easily. Mm-hmm. I think if I were in an office, it'd be socializing would be tempting.
just at the water cooler.
Yeah, which has its benefits. Don't get me wrong, but I prefer just being here and focusing on the work personally.
One of the best pieces of advice I heard about remote work is that make sure the team as a whole, as you alluded to, is remote, is distributed, as opposed to like making a special consideration for you, because there's going to be so much sort of hallway banter and team camaraderie and building that you're going to miss out on, and it's just going to be hard to grow as a one of the few or the only remote employee in terms of raises, promotions, getting good projects. It's just you're not going to be on people's sort of top of mind as compared to colleagues that are physically around them. So remote work can be a disadvantage if you're in that type of situation.
Sure,
but if it's fully remote, like in your situation, it can be good.
Well, yeah, and I should specify we're a distributed team insofar as anyone can work remote, but we do have our New York office, and there's definitely a segment of the team that's there, but then there's a huge segment of the team that's not. And what's nice is we make sure to have constant communication. We're doing stand-ups every day, so we're always talking to one another, and twice a year, we all kind of fly into headquarters at New York for a week.
That's nice. Twice a year for a week. That's a good chunk of time.
Yeah, and which is nice because you finally get to see all these people in person. And it's nice. But for the job hunt with remote, I think one of the hardest things. Well, yeah, I think the lack of experience might be the toughest thing. I think that will also change over time as remote work becomes more standard.
Are you comparing it to like your cohort mates, or what do you mean by, because everybody in Capstone is the same, similar profile?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it kind of, again, like I said, it's just my own kind of gut intuition. I feel like when you're in person, there's all sorts of things that you can do that you don't have as a remote candidate.
Oh, you mean during an interview process?
And during an interview and just getting the interview, I think with the remote, which is tough again, is if they're not going to take that risk, because they can't. If you're in an office, they can watch you, right? Essentially, they can make sure you're doing the work. They can't do that as really the same way if you're remote. So there's a bit more of a risk. And I think
what do they say? Like 90% of communication is nonverbal. So So most of it's kind of like body language, gestures, intonation, things like that.
Yeah. And so I think that's the one tough thing there. Now, for getting interviews though, at the same time, if you just got to be smart about how you do it. So I kind of looked at it I had kind of 3 tiers of how I did this. So the website I use, and anyone who wants to do remote work, I would highly suggest this, is AngelList, because I found it to be the best for finding remote jobs. I didn't find LinkedIn to be that good. And what I would do is I kind of I find anything that I thought I might be a match for, and I would put it into 3 categories. There's the really, really long shot, which when that was the case, I would just do the AngelList quick apply and kind of just have a little blurb that I could more or less copy or paste, right? And then send it off. If I thought there was a pretty decent chance, what I would do is I would actually go to the company website and go through whatever resume process they have on their website. I think that's a bit better. And if I really wanted to work at a company, what I would do is I would try to talk either through LinkedIn or their Slack channel to someone at that company, and then submit a resume formally or try to get a referral, basically. The reason I broke it up like this is because, you can't waste your time on companies you think you have a long shot on. And I found it to be pretty good. I mean, you probably remember, Chris, there was only maybe at the very beginning where I wasn't getting anything. And then even though it took a little bit, once I started getting bites, I was interviewing constantly.
Yeah, you're busy. Yeah.
For whatever odd reason, it took a while before some of the first offers were coming in. But there was a couple, even early on, I got to the last stage and did well.
Now, I always want to qualify. You say it took a while only because you had a lot of cohort mates who, finished quite quickly.
That's true.
Right. So it's all relative. I don't want to freak people out. Like, you finished within, within 3 months or so, right?
3 months. So that's actually not too bad. So maybe all my stuff about remote, I'm saying this, but my intuition's completely off. But
no, I mean, it's just, I look at a lot of some, other boot camp, how they report data, and it's always like 6 months, right? They'll be like 85% of our graduates got a job within 6 months. And so, you got a 6-figure job remote in Tulsa in 3 months. I would say that's good, but
that is good. I think
it did take a while just because Capstone is so aggressive. I think in that, you have a lot of people finishing like in just within the first month, right? And so you're like, oh, I'm behind. Oh, I need to do more.
Yeah, I think, like I said, remote comes with its own challenges, and you just have to be okay with those challenges. If you are, I think you can get a good job. Again, have a strong project of some kind or something strong to lead with, because that will help you in the process, because you'll talk about whatever project you're working on. And that's also really a case for you to develop your skills as both a developer and an engineer. And I think for me personally, Kronos was invaluable for where I am working right now.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting and unique project. What about advice? Any advice for sort of, before we go here, any advice for those earlier in the launch school curriculum? We have people right now listening that are like in prep or not even in prep. So even as far back as that, how do you, just think about you, right? When you're finished with your master's program and somebody goes, you should learn programming. How do you map, that Nick to the Nick of today? Like, how would you bridge that gap?
I think there's 2 pieces of advice I would give. The first is, and I think most students now I see, because I still hang around the Slack channel, I think most of the students now kind of implicitly get this. Don't deviate too much from the core curriculum, right? I went in with the assumption with programming that launch school is going to tell me what I need to know when I need to know it. So if it's not in the current course, I'm not going to worry about it all that much. When I was doing the program full 40 hours a week, I would take an hour a day maybe to do my own reading on the side. And I would usually do it on something like Ruby or JavaScript. One thing if I could do differently is, I think some of the ideas that I know now or concepts, I would have done that in my free reading time. I would have liked to have learned Docker in my free reading time because it was so easy to pick up. It would have been nice to just have that jump started. But again, that's 1 out of 8 hours a day, right? For the other amount of time, I'm doing either the core curriculum or I was doing coding challenges, right? Practicing. Because the reality is, if you're coming here because you're learning programming, assume the teacher knows more than you, right? And I think you'll be fine. Don't bother learning React.
Yeah, unless specifically, 100%, I want to go over there, right? But I feel like most people don't, and they're just kind of swayed by some random article they see, and just like, don't miss out on this wave, And it's like FOMO. It's more fear than I know for sure I want to do that.
And it's an unfounded fear. Well, I shouldn't say unfounded, but maybe it is unfounded fear, because think about it. all those waves are built upon the fundamentals, right? So, and look at, by the way, frameworks come and go, right? The fundamentals don't. They're the one thing, our industry changes so quickly, but the fundamental concepts we're talking about are going to be here to stay. And so if you learn those, by the time you get out, the next wave will be coming. And then if you want to surf on it, go for it. But
Right.
don't prematurely do it because you're going to wipe out, if we're going to take this
Good analogy. I like that. I like the surfing analogy.
Or in worst case scenario, you get eaten by a shark, right? No,
All right.
but it's true though. This is the unchanging foundation. Now I'm sounding like I'm Plato, right? The unchanging foundation upon which we build it on. And then when those things come and go, you'll be fine. You'll be able to pick them up, no problem, And I would say that is the first piece of advice. And the second piece of advice would be for people who are worried about the time is don't. Because the book, are they still reading in the prep course, the George Leonard book,
Yeah.
The Master?
Yeah, it's still there. Yeah.
So one of the models in there that I really liked that he talked about was the difference between the master and the hacker. Because I think this was very apt for me. I kind of alluded to the beginning of this interview that I used to kind of do some of these more game modding type things.
Mm-hmm.
That was always in a very hackerish way. I didn't learn, because fundamentals were boring. I wanted to do something now. And so I got very stunted early on in how much I could do. I think, too dependent upon copying tutorials. And I was able to do some fun stuff, but it was never anything that majorly impressive. Because it was very much kind of done hackish. Whereas you look at now, in April 2017, I was doing, Hello World and 99 bottles of beer on the wall. And now I'm, programming microservices for microservice architecture, right? I think the difference is there. And you've said this before, and I think it's true that slow is fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're making an investment. It will be a little slow in the beginning. But you can't look at your growth is not going to be linear, right? Your growth really is going to be exponential. That's how you have to look at it. If this were a linear process, I can understand why someone might be concerned, but it's not. It's exponential because once you have that baseline down, you're going to be able to pick up things a lot faster than you realize.
You got to try to get on that curve, right? Try to hit your right on that curve.
You'll get on that curve. Whereas if you kind of stay at this kind of more hacker level where you're just learning frameworks, you're not really learning the fundamentals, at best you're going to plateau, right? At best you're going to plateau. So I would say don't worry about the time. You have to treat it as an investment, and a year or two of your life or even more, 10 years from now, if you're willing, hopefully, right?
The longer you want to stay in this field, the more this path is valid for you, right? Like if you're not sure if this is a career for you and you just want to build an idea, and if that doesn't pan out, you're going to go to pharmacy school, then this path doesn't make sense. Sure,
of course. If you're not in it for the long term, then launch school is not for you. If you want to do this just as a little side hobby for fun, no, I would say probably not for you. But if this is what you're trying to do as a career and you're serious about it, I would obviously say that this is the path. Obviously, I've done very well through it. So
let's finish up. And the final thought here is your company is launching something. Is that right? Are you allowed to say or no?
I think so. I kind of alluded to previously, but right, like I said, I'm on the cloud team, so we are about building a cloud native offering. I'm not going to say when necessarily that will go public, but it's something that's coming on the horizon. So for anyone who's interested in Timescale, they of course can pay attention. I think we were at the top of Hacker News recently because we announced that we have clustering coming up.
You guys are on top of Hacker News all the time. I've seen it pop up like 3 or 4 times.
Well, we're kind of doing really well really quickly, which is great.
And are you allowed to say what part you worked on it and your contribution?
I think so. Kind of what I've been doing on this cloud team is, I've been building out some of the key microservices so far. I've built out a couple of them surrounding managing accounts and stuff like that and projects and whatnot. I helped to lay this foundation for our kind of our GraphQL gateway, as we call it. It's the API that interacts with the rest of the microservice system. I also am working on a proof of concept that's thankfully working now. We've got some more to do on it, called TimesSQL is what we're tentatively calling it. So the idea here is that we're going to have in your browser, you'll be able to interact with the terminal that will connect you to a timescale instance in the cloud. So you don't have to download the PSQL binary if you want to just, check on your data or do some, a little experimentation. Probably wouldn't use it for a production use case, but you could use it for all sorts of other things. So been able to work on that. I kind of laid the foundation for that. And of course, all of this wasn't done by me solely. And my teammates of course, have their hands in it too. And they've been a great team. They're all better than me as far as I'm concerned.
That's where you need to be. That's where you want to be.
Yeah, because that's how you learn.
Yeah.
I've learned so much just from them. Them teaching me both on the system design level and just better coding practices. So those are kind of the things I've been working on. And that giant stack of technologies I've told you about, I just refer to it at this point now as a CNCF stack because the vast majority of it are CNCF projects.
That's awesome.
Because cloud engineering is what I wanted to do. So, and I'll say that Timescale was kind of always my number one choice. And so I was stoked when I found out that I was going to work here.
And now you're building core services in their offerings. And I'll just leave this. I know I keep saying this, but one last thought is one of the things that shocked me when I first started working, many, many years ago, was how features, even at big companies, are built by like one person or two people. It's not like hundreds and hundreds of people. Sometimes you're like, Microsoft, they need to do better here. It's like one person or two people, right? And so when you're in these type of roles, you have tremendous responsibility. You're responsible for a lot, but you got to be capable, right? You got to know how to at least do, just-in-time learning, relying on the fundamentals you've already mastered to help you there. Otherwise, you don't stand a chance, right? It's not that you're going to be on a team of like 10 people and you can just watch. It's really great to see sort of you in that position and in such an amazing project, an amazing company. So hopefully, maybe we'll bring you back in the future, season 3 or 4 of this podcast, and follow up and see how you've grown over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to do that.
You didn't know you just committed like a lifetime to launch when we signed up, right? This is a longitudinal study here.
I kind of figured once I was doing Capstone that was going to be the case. So
we're going to check in every year.
Yeah. So I'm still on the channel, right? So clearly I haven't distanced myself that much.
Yeah, I like seeing you guys pop in sometimes. It's funny because sometimes like Friday nights will just be only like Capstone grads. All right. Thanks so much for taking the time, Nick, and we'll keep in touch.
All right. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Launch School podcast. Check back for new episodes and don't forget to like, subscribe, and review.